topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello, and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. My name is Bahia Yaksan. I am a diversity educator and a core alignment coach, which means I train individuals and organizations to identify patterns of bias that harm others and which actually harms all of us, and teach how to step out of those patterns by cultivating new ones that are far more inclusive and create belonging, which does bring people closer together, increases understanding, and makes happier communities. Today, our show is titled by our guest, "We Cannot Suppress Hate Speech, but we are obligated to condemn it." I'm very delighted to have an esteemed attorney, Professor Alan Brownstein, joining us today. He's a professor emeritus and nationally recognized constitutional law scholar. He taught constitutional law, law and religion, and torts at the University of California, Davis School of Law for more than 30 years. Before his retirement, he formerly held the Boochever and Bird Endowed Chair for the study and teaching of freedom and equality, which is a very high honor. And also before he was a professor, he clerked for Judge Frank M. Coffin of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Professor Brownstein is well known for his scholarship on the Establishment Clause and on the First Amendment. We are going to focus on freedom of speech and the First Amendment and hate speech, and it's going to be very interesting. Thank you for joining us tonight. So happy to have you here, Professor Brownstein.
Thank you for inviting me.
So sorry, go ahead. Well, I'd like to actually thank our sponsors, and I believe our as we start the show, that this program is brought to you by the City of Davis Arts and Cultural Affairs Program and the California Creative Corps, a pilot program funded by the City of Sacramento's Office of Arts and Culture and the California Arts Council, a state agency, as an engagement campaign designed to increase public awareness about issues of social justice, climate resiliency, and more. The Creative Corps program, backed by Governor Gavin Newsom and the state legislature, looks to increase public awareness on topics such as health and safety, water and energy conservation, climate mitigation, emergency preparedness, social justice, and civic and community engagement. So thank you to our sponsors. Sorry, I cut you off there for a second.
No. So I think you asked me to begin by setting out what the free speech clause of the First Amendment is and does.
Please.
Is that right?
Please. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so the free speech clause of the First Amendment protects private individuals and institutions from government attempts to suppress speech or to interfere with their ability to express their ideas, their viewpoints, whatever messages they might want to communicate. Now, that's a key idea here, is that the free speech clause only protects individuals and private institutions against state action, against government interference, with their activities, with their expressive activities. The First Amendment does not protect anyone against private interference with their speech. There may be statutes, there may be common law claims that could be brought against someone who interferes with your ability to speak. But you can't bring a constitutional claim under the First Amendment against anyone other than government. Now, the free speech clause has been interpreted over 200 years in United States constitutional jurisprudence, and the doctrine that is developed is quite complicated. But the default position for freedom of speech is that most everything is fully protected speech. Political speech, artistic speech, recreational speech. Again, this is the default position. There are some narrow categories of unprotected speech. Obscenity is one of them. True threats is another. Fighting words is another. And inciting imminent violence or unlawful conduct is also unprotected speech. But these are very limited categories, very narrowly defined. And for the purposes of our discussion, it's important to understand that what would conventionally be described as hate speech, speech that expresses bigotry, prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism, all of this is fully protected speech. Hate speech is not a juridical category. It receives no less protection than any other subject or viewpoint of speech. Now, a lot of people find that difficult to accept. And certainly, and you do. And certainly, if you compare United States constitutional jurisprudence with that of other Western democracies, you see that the United States is odd country out. Most Western democracies do restrict hate speech, at least to some extent. So the first question we might ask is, well, why do we do that? Why do we protect speech that is bad speech, that expresses evil messages? Well, the reason we protect this speech is not because the courts doubt that it is bad speech. It's not because the courts doubt that this speech is harmful. Courts recognize the harm that hate speech causes, but they concur that the speech must be protected in any case. One way to think about this is to recognize that fundamental rights like freedom of speech are political goods. And as such, we pay a price when we purchase them, just like you would pay a price to purchase a material good. And freedom of speech is an expensive political good. Individuals, groups, and the general public all incur costs and suffer harms as a result of our protecting this speech. But we think the value of freedom of speech justifies our protecting it. Now, another way to think about this, and to distinguish the United States from other Western democracies, is to recognize that in our political culture, we are much more individualistic and much more suspicious of government than a lot of other countries, which might be described as more communitarian, where they are not as wary of government decisions about speech or religion as we are. So if you're looking for an underlying principle that might explain the protection we provide to hate speech or other kinds of bad speech, is that we trust the people more than we trust the government. We trust the people to be able to distinguish between good speech and bad speech, between strong arguments and weak arguments, more than we trust the government to decide for us which speech is so bad, so dangerous, so hurtful that we shouldn't be allowed to hear it or see it and to evaluate it for ourselves. Now, again, not all Western democracies agree with that basic principle, but it's a foundational principle for a United States constitutional jurisprudence under the First Amendment. Now, if I may, could I speak some about the harm that hate speech causes, or would you rather I speak about something else?
Oh no, I'd love that, because that's part of the, I think, the price that we pay. I
Yes,
just
it
wanted to
is.
say, my son was trying to educate me and point out how important it is to protect all speech, which you're confirming.
Yeah, well,
But please,
your son has the right idea.
yes, he
Uh,
does.
um, so, hate speech is generally understood as causing two kinds of harms, and they're both serious harms. One is the emotional, psychological harm that the victim of hate speech will experience when they hear it. Uh, and I cannot uh, dismiss that harm. Some people say, "Oh, it's just emotional harm, it's psychological harm. That's not a really serious harm." From my perspective, that is a very serious harm. Uh, on the other hand, one thing we can say about that harm is that it can often be avoided. So if you know somebody is going to give a racist speech on the quad, and it's a big open space in the University of California, Davis, where a lot of speakers are invited to express their views by various student groups. If you know that this speaker is going to express a bigoted message, you don't go to the quad while that person is talking. Often there's a way to avoid the message. Um, the other concern we have about this harm uh, is that if emotional distress and offense can be the basis for suppressing speech, we're worried that it would allow government to suppress far too much speech. Um, because offense and emotional distress as a result of what someone says is very much in the eye of the beholder. And I know what some state governments in our country view as hate speech is something very, very different than what I view as hate speech. So allowing government to identify certain kinds of speech as hate speech because the offense it causes to some people is unacceptable, that allows government a lot of discretion to suppress and interfere with people's speech. The other harm that hate speech causes, and in some ways this is even more insidious and problematic, is that hate speech creates the risk that some people will listen to these prejudiced, bigoted messages and be persuaded by it. And they will become bigots. They will act in unlawful ways. They will discriminate against people because of their race or religion or sexual orientation or gender. Or they will even commit acts of violence against those individuals. So that concern about changing behavior is a very, very real risk that results from allowing hate speech to be expressed. And again, I don't want to say anything to suggest that that risk isn't real. It is very real. We know that through the internet, hate speech is being widely spread, and unfortunately, far too many people hear it and are influenced by it. Um,
Yeah.
Now, that second harm, what I call the incitement harm, gets a little bit complicated. So let me stop here and see if you want me to talk about that, because it'll take me a few minutes, or if you have something else you would like me to address.
Oh, thank you. I would like you, but I wanted to ask two questions
Sure,
first.
please.
Well, one was to your point earlier about America's constitutional protection of freedom of speech is a reflection of that we, the people, put more trust in the people than the government as compared to other Western democracies. And it makes me, I just want to say out loud, I think my, it just brings up the thought, I think part of that trust was trusting we would educate ourselves, that we would educate our generations to come, so that we'd learn ourselves to have some self accountability and discernment about what is hate speech. And then I see there's a good incentive to like cultivate moral behavior, but assuming that we can teach it and pass it along and generate more mindful, careful, thoughtful speech than not. But as you say, we're in a period of time where it's just kind of gone rampantly towards more and more hate speech. But then and now I just want to turn back to you, and please do say more about incitement
Okay, well,
risk.
just let me say in response to your question, which is a very good question. Uh, some people say, well, we have this trust that we place with the people, that the best way to deal with bad speech is to have all speech tested in the marketplace of ideas, and good speech will drive out bad speech, will effectively refute it. Well, that may sound better on paper than in the real world. What happens if this trust is misplaced?
Yeah.
And actually, there's a very cogent opinion by Supreme Court Justice Holmes. He's writing in dissent, and he was a real fierce defender of freedom of speech. And one of the things he conceded, which I think might help people to understand why we do this, is that our constitutional system, according to Justice Holmes, and I think he's correct in this explanation, is an experiment. Um, you know, he says every year, if not every day, we have to trust our salvation to this idea, to this basic commitment that we can trust people. And in a sense, it's a revolutionary idea. Popular sovereignty was a revolutionary idea. And again, sometimes the people will get it wrong. And certainly particular individuals will get it wrong. But that's what we've accepted as our foundational commitment, that we believe in some basic fundamental rights, like freedom of speech, like freedom of religion, that these are decisions that need to be made by the people, not by the government. And we recognize that we will pay a price, that there are costs and consequences for doing that. Now, with regard to incitement,
I think your mic is a little off.
let me see. Should I sit a little closer? Does this help at all?
I wonder if it's your sound is waving in and out. I wonder if it's like a for some reason.
I'm hearing everything fine.
Can you hear him fine, Rebel?
I can.
Okay. Okay, the engineer said your sound's coming through fine. Sorry.
Okay, I'll speak more slowly. That may help.
Thank
I know
you.
I have a tendency to speak too fast. I was raised in New York, in the Bronx. New Yorkers speak fast. For about 100 years, the United States Supreme Court wrestled with a problem of incitement. And, a little over 100 years ago, during World War I, individuals who were opposed to America's entry into that war distributed anti-war leaflets. They would be considered pretty innocuous today, but during World War I, the people who distributed those leaflets or who stood up on a soapbox and expressed anti-war messages were prosecuted by the government and convicted for inciting mutiny in the armed forces, obstruction of the war effort, interference with the government's ability to pursue its war aims. And under the interpretation of the First Amendment that the court accepted way back then, the government didn't have to show very much in order to prosecute and convict people for communicating those messages. The court said as long as there's some tendency on the part of the speech that's being suppressed to incite people to engage in unlawful conduct, that's enough. And that's not much of a showing that speech has some tendency to convince people to interfere with a war effort. But there were very powerful dissents that were written in those cases by Justice Holmes, who I mentioned earlier, and Justice Brandeis. And what these justices argued was that any criticism of the government expressed with passion and with conviction might convince somebody to interfere with government activities or policies. So if that's all it took to prosecute someone and convict them for incitement, then the government could suppress just about any criticism of government action on the grounds that it had the tendency to persuade people to interfere with the government's activities. And Holmes and Brandeis argued for a different test. They said, if you're going to prosecute or convict someone for incitement, you have to show, that is, the government has to show, that the unlawful conduct or violence that's being incited is imminent. It is going to immediately and directly follow from the speech that's at issue. And these justices argued that if there's time for good speech to be expressed, to refute and to counter bad speech, then we should rely on the people to be able to distinguish the good speech from the bad speech and to ignore or reject the bad speech in favor of the good speech that's being expressed, to refute it. Now, the title of our talk today, where I say government can't suppress hate speech, but it has to condemn it, is that this principle that the government doesn't need to suppress bad speech because we can count on the people to step forward and to counter bad speech with good speech, so that the best response to bad speech is more speech, not less speech. Well, that presupposes that people will step up to the plate and will challenge the bad speech. If they don't do that, if they don't accept that implicit obligation, then the foundation for this constitutional doctrine is fundamentally undermined. And I would argue that this obligation applies to everyone. It applies in particular to people who have very loud voices, whose position gives them microphones, in a sense, so they can be heard where other people might have more difficulty having their messages heard. So if you're a government official, you can't suppress hate speech, but you can certainly speak out and condemn it. And I think you're constitutionally obligated to do that. You can't be sued for not doing that. But the whole foundation of the doctrine presupposes that people of goodwill will step forward. Doesn't just apply to government, applies to clergy, applies to the media, applies to attorneys, but it also applies to John and Jane Doe. It applies to the average individual.
I so appreciate that. I just want to underscore that I love hearing from this highly esteemed constitutional scholar that we're constitutionally obligated to counter hate speech. Otherwise, there's a flaw.
Otherwise, the argument, is flawed. Now, this argument, I'm describing it from a constitutional perspective. Of course, we all know it from a normative perspective. We all know that the only thing that's necessary for evil to succeed is for good people to be silent. We've learned that, or we should have learned that in our culture. But I'm saying it's not just in our culture; it's actually embedded in our constitutional framework. And I think that's a really important message that people should understand. So if a government official says, well, I don't like what this person said, but what can I do? First Amendment protects that person's speech. I think the response should be, you can't suppress it. You absolutely cannot impose disproportionate burdens on that individual's ability to speak, but you can certainly condemn it. You can certainly explain to your constituents why what this person is saying is bad speech, is bigotry, does not deserve respect, should not be persuasive to the community.
Thank you for making that utterly clear, that it's embedded in our constitutional framework to counter, to name it and to counteract it with good speech.
Yes. Yep.
And it's interesting, the part about the timing, because like you said, presupposes someone's there who can counter it, and in time for the same body of people who heard the hate speech to hear the countering of the speech. And I too believe it's individuals' responsibility as well. Like you said, it should be normative.
If the threat is sufficiently imminent, so if someone is trying to incite a lynch mob, that's, you can punish that speech. That's unprotected speech. And Holmes and Brandeis recognize that, because there isn't time for good speech to intercede and counter the bad speech. So that's why timing is so critical, because you have to give people an opportunity. They need that opportunity to say, wait a minute, don't listen to what this person is saying. And when a mob is being incited to attack someone, to attack a mosque or a synagogue, or attack individuals because of their sexual orientation or their race, there may not be an opportunity for people to intercede. And in that circumstance, government can intervene and has to intervene to protect individuals.
And again, to reiterate a point that you made earlier, that also unprotected, in a sliver of unprotected, is when there's an actual, like even an individual threat, but it has to be like specific, like I'm going to, use a weapon or something like that. That has to be pretty specific, right?
Okay, good question. So let me distinguish between two categories of unprotected speech. One is incitement, okay, where the harm we're trying to avoid is that people will be persuaded by it and will do bad things.
Right.
Okay, and that's what I've been talking about.
Yep.
Another category of unprotected speech is what is called threats.
Okay.
And it has to be a true threat, which is to say, some people say things that are kind of threatening rhetoric or even threats in jest. And the courts say that's still protected. But a true threat is a threat that's expressed to an individual where a reasonable person hearing that message would feel frightened that the speaker is going to commit an act of violence. against him or her, and against them. And threats are another narrow category of unprotected speech. It has to be directed at someone, and the victim has to hear it, because what you're trying to avoid is not persuading people to do bad things. You want to protect people against the experience of being threatened with violence. And that's a particular kind of emotional distress that we distinguish from mere offense. And while we won't protect you from being offended, we will protect you from having your personal security threatened by some third party who threatens to use violence against you or your family. And sadly, more and more people today are experiencing these kinds of threats. And because of the availability of media and the ease of communication, often law enforcement can't identify who it is who's expressing the threat. So you see, schools and libraries receive phone calls saying there's a bomb in your facility. Yeah. And of course, we have to take that seriously. You have to evacuate the building. You have to search it. You may never find out who it was who expressed that message. If you did, you could certainly prosecute them for communicating a threat.
I want to hold that thought. That's it's bringing a lot to my mind, but I realize we need to take a break, and I apologize that it's coming right now. So thank you. We'll get right back to that after a break. We're going to hear a song by, thank you, by Emma's Revolution is the duo who sings the song, and it's called Keep on Moving Forward.
Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on moving proudly. Keep on moving proudly. Keep on moving proudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna reach across our border. Reach across our border. Reach across our border. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna end the occupation. End the occupation. End the occupation. war together. Stop this war together. Stop this war together. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. 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 Never turning back.
As to a lot of different situations in different parts of the world over time. I wanted to just finish. I know we had a couple of the topics we want to get to, but I just wanted to acknowledge all the so many groups of people receiving direct threats now that you were like judges and election workers and volunteers at polls, and it's people who volunteer to count votes, and American citizens who are legal, whether they're legal from another country or legal because they grew up here, but like you said, the color of their skin or the religion. It's just really sad right now. We're just having these waves at this period of time. But um, I wanted you to be able to share your perspective of Zionism. That was something that we talked about before. If that's not too much of a shift at the moment.
Well, let me suggest a way where we could connect it to what I've been saying earlier. So one of the issues that arises with regard to hate speech or alleged hate speech is who gets to decide whether a particular message should be characterized as prejudice or bigotry, racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And there's no easy answer to that question. People will have very, very different views. But one of the ways that I think makes it easier to understand free speech jurisprudence and free speech culture is to recognize that freedom of speech is kind of an equal opportunity right. It applies the same way to everybody. And if you want to be protected with regard to what you're saying, you have to be willing to protect other people with regard to what they're going to say. So
Absolutely.
when the issue arises, who gets to decide whether speech might be characterized as hate speech or not, even though it can't be suppressed in either case? You could look at the intent of the speaker. And a lot of people who say things that I might view as bigotry insist that they're not bigots and they don't intend this message to reflect, racism or anti-Semitism or misogyny or homophobia or Islamophobia. Or we could look at the victim of the speech, the person who says, I'm experiencing this as hate speech, and it's my experience that should count, not what the speaker is trying to communicate. And we see this conflict between whose views should be respected across the panoply
Hmm.
of potential hate speech. So, when people were arguing Black Lives Matter, and then some people were responding and saying all lives matter, some people thought that was hate speech. That seemed to be rejecting the idea that Black Lives Matter. That was the experience of the
Yeah.
people who heard the message. If you talk to some of the people who expressed it, no, we're not trying to say that Black people's lives don't matter. We just think everybody's lives matter. And
And they were missing the message that Black lives should matter as much as white lives.
that's right. That's right. And you see some of the same arguments occurring with regard to homophobia, where some people say, I'm just expressing what my religion teaches. And the people who feel that they're being defamed, in a sense, and insulted by these messages say that, well, but the message itself is very demeaning to us, and it suggests we're not fully human, and we don't have the rights to do things like marry that other people have. So that's where the issue of, when we talk about anti-Semitism, how do we understand expressions of hatred directed towards Zionism, and whether that is anti-Semitic or not? It's not an easy question to answer. There's no question in my mind that there are a great many Jews for whom Zionism is an integral part of their Jewish identity. Judaism is a little more complicated than some faiths which are grounded exclusively in belief. Like if you asked a Methodist how you define a Methodist, they would describe their beliefs according to scripture. But if you ask a Jew what it means to be a Jew, they're going to say, well, partly it's a matter of faith, partly it's a matter of culture, partly we are a people. It's simply more complicated. Older faiths often had these multiple dimensions. I think you see it some in Native American groups in the United States, where their ethnic identity and their religious beliefs kind of fit together and a part of their identity. And, given that reality, the idea that as a people, Jews need to have a place that they can call home, where they will be protected against both discrimination and violence, becomes easier to understand, particularly since over the last 2,000 years, there's never been any place where Jews could live with full security, knowing that they wouldn't be subjected to discrimination, to violence, to expulsion. One of the things that disturbs a lot of Jews living in the United States, where we feel more comfortable here than we felt in a lot of other countries, is that if you talk to people who came to the United States from Germany and escaped before the Nazis made it impossible to escape, they said their families felt the same way about living in Germany. They thought, what could possibly go wrong? They were fully accepted by German society as having the same rights and interests as everybody else. And we know how that turned out. That's the reality that Jews have experienced historically. Now, does that mean that you can't criticize the state of Israel for some of its actions over the last 75 years? Absolutely not. There's never been a country that hasn't done things that deserve criticism and serious criticism. Certainly true of the United States. I mean, I don't think that the criticisms that I've directed at United States policy in the past, or some of the current policies that are being promoted by certain political figures in the United States, I don't think that suggests in any way that I don't respect the United States. I don't love my country. You can have both of those feelings at the same time.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
you say, you know, the United States is a great country, and it's done some bad things. It's done things we
Totally.
should be proud of, and it's done some things we should be ashamed of. And I think the same is true for a country like Israel, a country like Pakistan, like virtually every country. You know, no country can say we've never done wrong, but that doesn't mean that the country shouldn't continue to exist as a place where its citizens can live with some sense of safety and security. Does that help you with that?
Oh yeah, I really appreciate that. And I like myself, I like to distinguish always between government actions and the people. And we know there's like a broad spectrum, right, of Jewish perspectives, and you know, Jews against Zionism, and who say no, it's a part of my ethnic and cultural identity. Look, I want you to know the historical meaning of it. It doesn't equal we want to annihilate Palestinians, which it can mean to some people. And so I really appreciate hearing different perspectives, broadening different perspectives, and also I really appreciate just the reinforcement that like we do have to be. It's part of like American. It's in our Constitution. We're obligated to speak out when a government is doing wrong. Or I know a lot of Americans feel guilty about how much we supply weapons to that other places are using to kill masses of people, you know, whether it's Palestine or other places. So
You can always legitimately express your views to criticize government. That's what the First Amendment protects. Again, it protects even hate speech, even racist and blatantly anti-Semitic speech. So it's not a question of whether you have a right to be heard. Now, there is a question of whether you have a right to be heard when in circumstances where other people would not be allowed to be heard. So, for example,
we need to
generally
balance.
speaking, obstruction is not protected by the free speech clause. And for me, that means if you obstruct access to a clinic providing abortion services, which happened all the time about 30 years ago when there was this group Operation Rescue, which was blockading entrances to clinics, and we had to have a federal law passed, the FACE law, to deal with that. You know, I remember having arguments with people who said, doesn't that violate free speech? And I say, no, obstruction is not speech. Free speech is grounded on persuading people.
And
not
obstruction
on coercing
is an
people.
action. I'm sorry, I have to tell you we have about 30 seconds. I didn't even get a chance to let you have a closing thought, but I so appreciate every thought you brought. I appreciate your
That could be
time.
my closing thought, that, you know, if you agree that obstruction is not protected for anti-abortion protesters, then it isn't appropriate for people who want to blockade access to a library or to an administrative building either. The same rules have to apply to everyone, regardless of the cause that you're espousing.
Thank you so much, Professor Brownstein. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to our ASL interpreter, Kenneth Arnold. I really appreciate your time and your hard work during our shows. And I want to thank our engineer Rebel, our producer Dean Piper, and all the listeners and viewers. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for It's Your Voice on Talk4TV or w4cy.com. And may we all have enriching conversations in diversity this week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech of the heart.